Let's look at graphing inequalities. An inequality just replaces our equal sign with a greater than or a less than, or a greater than or equal to, or a less than or equal to. When we're graphing inequalities, it's just like we're graphing a line, but we have to make two decisions. The first decision we have to make is whether we're using a solid line or a dotted line. We're going to use a solid line if we have greater than or equal to or less than or equal to. We're going to use a dotted line if we have greater than or less than. So here, if we have this equals sign underneath, this line underneath our greater than or less than, we're using a solid line. Otherwise, it'll be dotted. The second decision we have to make is when we shade, whether we're shading above the line or below the line. We're going to shade above the line if we have a greater than or a greater than or equal to. And we're going to shade below the line if we have a less than or a less than or equal to. So let's just keep these notes off to the side while we take a look at an example. Let's say that we're asked to graph the line 2x minus 3y is greater than or equal to -9. Now remember, when we were graphing a line, we wanted it to be in the form y equals ax plus b, where we had y on the left-hand side and everything else on the right-hand side. When we're graphing inequalities, we want the same thing. We want the y on the left-hand side all by itself and everything else on the right-hand side. So let's rearrange this and see if we can make that happen. Let's subtract 2x from both sides. When we do that, we're left with -3y is greater than or equal to -2x minus 9. We tend to write our x's first, just to stay consistent with this form. Now let's divide everything by a -3, so that we'll have our y by itself. When we divide by -3 here, we're left with a y. Because we're dividing by a negative number, we have to flip this inequality from a greater than or equal to a less than or equal to. We just change its direction. If we're dividing by a positive number, we don't have to make that switch. But because we're dividing by a negative number in this case, we do. We'll switch it from pointing this way to pointing this way. Now let's look at this other side of our inequality. We have a -2 over -3x, and a -9 divided by a -3 is a +3. Now, just like we had a negative divided by a negative being a positive here, in our fraction, we have a negative divided by a negative, so that can also become a positive. We can get rid of these two negative signs because it's in the numerator and the denominator. And we can rewrite this as y is less than or equal to 2/3 x plus 3. If this were an equal sign, we would start at the 3, right? Start at our b value, and then rise 2 and run 3 to the right. We're going to do the same thing now. So we start on the y-axis, we find the 3 and put a dot there. From this point, we'll rise 2 and run 3 to the right. Now, before we draw our line, we have to make our decision whether we're using a solid line or a dotted line. So we have less than or equal to. So up here, we said if we had less than or equal to, we were using a solid line. So we'll use a solid line to connect these dots. There we go. Now that we've connected our dots, we have to decide whether we're shading above the line or below the line. So here we have a less than or equal to, and if we look at our shading, less than or equal to means we're shading below the line. So if we look kind of at our y-axis, that helps us to see above and below, right? Where our y-axis and our line cross each other, above the line, up here, below the line, down here. So to shade, we're shading below the line, which means we're shading in this direction. You can use arrows if you want to. You can shade it all in if you want to. Whatever makes the most sense to you, just so that you know that kind of all of this area is a solution to the inequality 2x minus 3y is greater than or equal to -9. I hope that helps in graphing inequalities.